Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks. That's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Robertson has Jordan. Allen shakes free. Gets two!
Gilmore on
Steph! Oh!
brother. Lead Toledo artists. You get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello and welcome to the Over and Back podcast. I am Jason Mann, and joining me is my co-host Rich Craich. Rich, glad to be here with you talking about the career of NBA and ABA legend Rick Barry.
Yes, yeah, a guy that we're done a ton of research on, bunch of background info, watched a lot of tape of him. I'm excited to talk about him. It's a very interesting character, one that it sort of gets overlooked in a lot of ways for how important he was to the history of basketball, and that's sort of why we're going to talk about him here today.
Yeah,
so I'm excited.
And some of that is definitely probably because he played a good portion of his career in the ABA, which is kind of, you know, at least at first for him was a lesser league than the ABA. You know, it later grew in strength and in stars and talent. And by the end of its run, you definitely was at least close to, if not, you know, equal with the NBA, certainly in its top stars. And some of that is that, quite frankly, Rick Barry had a prickly personality.
I was gonna say kind of a dick.
Yeah,
so
you could.
That sort of doesn't help.
I read his book Confessions of a Basketball Gypsy, which was written.
It was like 3 years into his career.
More like 6 years into his career.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
It was written. He was in between seasons with the Nets, his last two ABA seasons. He spent 4 years in the ABA and had done 2 years with the Warriors. I guess actually after his fifth season. And it's actually an interesting book. Talks a lot about his upbringing and his legal cases and things that are going on. But I would have to describe him, especially as a youth, as a bit of a rapscallion. And he was just obsessively competitive, stubborn, willful. Yeah, he was. He once punched a nun, so that's kind of goes.
He said that in his book. Has anybody ever corroborated that?
I believe it. Well, his parents.
Okay, all right. Well, then they would know then.
So they talk about it. One nice thing about the book, I don't want to get too deep into it, but it actually includes like portions where the people that he's talking about in the book have a chance to like respond to what he says. Not his parents, also his wife, but also like some coaches and people he didn't particularly like, and people that were opposed to him in the legal cases. So it's interesting from that perspective. It is actually an interesting book to read if you are definitely very interested in Rick Barry, since he never did a later, autobiography that covered, all of his career.
And then obviously Terry Pluto's Loose Balls is another great reference. That's one that I look back at a lot of this because obviously, as we're going to get into with his ABA stuff, that's the book. I mean, if you're a basketball fan and haven't read that book, listen to the rest of this podcast, but then when you're done with that, go read that book because it's an incredible.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think it's interesting that Rick Barry really follows the. He fits right in that part of NBA and ABA history that's right near the end of the Russell Celtics dominating era, and then his last year is the first Bird Magic year. So it's like right that like in between era that's sort of hard to define. There aren't the dominant teams. Maybe the stars of that era just don't shine as brightly as we think of with Bird and Magic and with Weston, Russell, and Chamberlain. For whatever reason, or just there were just so many changes in the NBA that I know we're going to talk about. So many more teams. It's just maybe harder to dig into a little bit. I'm not sure, but I think he's just a guy who really almost encapsulates everything about that in-between era.
Absolutely. Certainly.
So, and in fact, we're going to chat with, we have a great guest today, Curtis Harris of ProHoopsHistory.com. So we'll be back in a moment to chat with him. All right, we're back, and we are on the line. We have Curtis Harris of the wonderful ProHoopsHistory.com with us. Curtis, thanks for joining the program.
Yeah, no problem.
And we're talking a little bit about some of the important things about Rick Barry's career. And one thing we definitely want to talk about is how important was Barry's jump to the ABA, both in establishing that league and in players eventually getting higher salaries and gaining free agency?
Well, it was obviously it was more important for the latter part of that, where it kind of created really the first instance of free agency in the NBA and professional basketball at that point. Because before that, players were pretty much bound to the team they were in the NBA, unless they got traded or they got cut by the team, but they couldn't really sign with another club. So that was the good part of the ABA for the players, is that it provided an outlet for them to try to have some leverage with the owners in the NBA. But the problem was that the court system generally sided with the NBA at first. So Rick Barry had to sit out a whole season before he was able to play for the ABA. And, that he had that problem. A few other players had that issue go on, and that wasn't resolved really until the mid-1970s.
One interesting thing about Barry, and we've sort of talked about it, or we will talk about it here shortly, is the in-between era that he played in. It's very, you have your Bill Russell and your Celtics and your Wilts, and then you sort of have this murky, sort of dark area, and then you have your Bird and Magic, and it's like this beacon of light to the NBA. Why do you think that era sort of has this weird connotation where people either forget about it, it's not talked about that much? Is it the lack of dominant teams? Is there not, the stars there were before? Why is that area so murky, or that era so murky, rather?
I mean, I think it's part of what we just talked about. It's the fact that you had two professional leagues for most of it, from 68 through 76, you had the NBA and the ABA. So you had like the best players in professional basketball were split between two leagues. So at some point you can kind of question, or just think about it, whether like if all those players had been in the NBA, then you probably would have had a more dominant team, sustained dominance over the first and middle part of the 70s. But that's part of the reason the basketball was fragmented at that point. And then by the late 70s, of course, you had the problem with cocaine coming out, and a lot of good players got wrapped up in that and kind of just floated around in the days. Even though they were still playing kind of well, you could tell that they weren't playing up to their full potential. Guys like, obviously, David Thompson's the one that comes to mind first off, the guy that really wasted a lot of potential, even though he was still a pretty good player, still didn't reach his full max.
What do you, when you think about Rick Barry and his career, what are some of the more interesting teams or teammates that he played with that stand out to you?
I would definitely say the team and teammates, you might get it all in one. That would be like the 1969 Oakland Oaks, where it actually had a pretty good cast of characters. It was obviously Rick Barry, and then Doug Moe and Larry Brown were both on that team. And, of course, they were both going to be really good coaches in the ABA and the NBA. And then also Warren Jabali was a rookie that season. And Jabali had the reputation of being the toughest guy in the ABA, and someone you didn't want to mess with on the court. He beat up anybody that crossed his path. But unfortunately, like Rick Barry actually only played half of that season, though, because he was playing a game against the Nets, and he got undercut driving to the basket on one play, and that blew out his knee when he fell to the ground. So he missed half the year, even though the Oaks went on to win the championship. He wasn't actually a part of it because he was sitting on the bench when they finally won the title. So that's
one of the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yes, I was just going to say, so that's probably the most interesting team he played for, but nobody really knows because it was in the ABA and it's the Oakland Oaks. Nobody really knows about that.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things with Barry, and especially with Warren, as you mentioned, and just Barry in general with anybody who he crossed, is that he wasn't the most diplomatic guy. He was a guy that clashed with literally anybody, coaches, management, players, media. I mean, anything and everybody that Barry could argue with, he would find a way. How do you think that sort of affects how we perceive Barry these days, and how we sort of in NBA circles received and talked about, and sort of his legacy? Does that affect his legacy in your mind?
Oh yeah, obviously, like that affects anybody, like any walk of life, your attitude, how you carry yourself, your reputation, how other people think of you. So Rick Barry was definitely a prickly personality, spoke his mind freely, didn't try to sugarcoat stuff when he said things to people. So he won a title with the Golden State Warriors in '75. But if he had won, say, 3-4 championships, then his personality might be more forgiven because, he was just a great winner, kind of like Michael Jordan. So you can just overlook kind of the personality flaws maybe. But if you have only one title, one championship, then people will kind of hold the negative stuff against you more easily than they would otherwise. So I definitely think that plays into our perception of them. And again, the stuff we talked about earlier, again, having two different leagues at that point and his career being split between the two leagues. So it's kind of hard to remember that he was pretty good for quite a while, but it was split between two leagues and had a lot of troubles, legal troubles, trying to get on the court during that time.
And, one thing that, of course, the NBA changed a lot from when Barry originally played. They were just a few years in the NBA away from having kind of unofficial quotas for how many black players each team would have, and the league as it evolved, particularly in the '70s, became increasingly African American, and it's just kind of interesting to think about whatever because certainly he benefited from that, and he even talks about that in his book, as where he got endorsements that Nate Thurmond wouldn't have gotten, even though he felt Nate Thurmond deserved them more and was a better player. And at the same time, he talks about, and on certain teams there was racial tension, particularly in Washington, the year he played for the Caps, where there were divisions between the white and black players. It's a tough question, but what do you think of just about the league evolving during that time to be more African American and those tensions? I mean, were those just kind of an inevitable part of society? Do you think that some of it was unique to basketball, but just because of it's one job in which there are so many more African Americans than white people?
I mean, yeah, and you're right. That is a pretty big question.
I don't mean to totally put you on the spot, but I think it is an interesting thing.
Talk all about racial tension.
Let's get to it.
And you wrote a post about Warren Jabali that I think is interesting. Maybe after we can talk a little more about.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll start larger American society first. Rick Barry's rookie season was, I think, 1965. That's smack dab in the middle. Actually, towards the tail end of the Civil Rights Movement. That's when you got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So, American society in general was changing. You have blacks increasingly getting better positions in American society. But the NBA was actually, a little bit ahead of society in terms of the proportion of blacks that were represented in the league. And actually, the NBA, of course, had the first, head coach that was black in the major league with Bill Russell. And I know their deputy commissioner by the mid-'70s was also African-American. So at a time when football or baseball and obviously hockey were struggling to get blacks on the field or in any kind of management level, by 1975, the NBA had a deputy commissioner that was African-American. So in some ways, they've always been ahead of the curve. But in some ways, he also spoke of Rick Barry in the endorsements, they still had the problem of the racism where all things being equal, between a black and a white player, the team would want to take a white player because they felt that would cater to the fans better. Unfortunately, that went on into the late '70s before that really finally, bit the dust. They were always selecting the slightly less or the slightly worse or just as good white player over the black player at those kind of moments. But for Rick Barry, again, him being kind of outspoken on lots of issues, he was one never to shy away from any topic. So he spoke his mind freely about race as well. And I know there's that one occasion where he had that gaffe when he was a broadcaster, where he said the watermelon grin about a black player. So you can see that he he was very perceptive, but again, could kind of put his foot in his mouth in certain situations. So I could see how some of his black teammates would kind of be rubbed the wrong way by him sometimes.
With Barry, and you wrote a great post at ProHoopsHistory.com. Obviously, you went through and discussed the life and career of Rick Barry. In your mind, maybe quickly, how would you sort of sum up Rick Barry? When the name Rick Barry comes to mind, what's the first thing that you sort of think of, or what's the most telling thing of his career? And you can't say the underhand free throw either. That's the other prerequisite. You can't say the underhand free throw because that's everybody. I mean, that's the one we and we're going to talk about that. It's like synonymous with him. So you can't say that. Other than the underhand free throw, what in your mind comes to, when you think of Rick Barry?
I think of a supremely gifted all-around small forward. Like when we think of a small forward in the NBA, it's like, the prototype looking through NBA's history. Rick Barry ought to be the one that comes up probably most often because he was a really good defender, excellent scorer. Like the first 10 years of his career, he averaged 30 points a game. But again, we don't realize that because it was split between the NBA and the ABA, and he had a few injuries that also kind of sapped some of the overall numbers. But great scorer, great rebounder, again, for a small forward, a great rebounder, an excellent passer. It's like you look at him, you're like, what does he do wrong? And you say pretty much nothing, except he might get pissed off at a teammate. That'd probably be the worst aspect of his game. So I think he really should be looked at as like the prototypical, if you want a small forward, that's the kind of mold you want to put your player in.
All right. Well, Curtis, thank you so much for being on our show. We definitely appreciate it. And just on a personal note, your website is just such an excellent look at NBA and ABA history and other, pro leagues of the past. You don't limit yourself just to those leagues, even deeper into history. And it's we're very hopeful with this show that we can somehow add a little bit to a lot of the research and conversations that you've started through your website. So thank you very much.
I know. Thank you all for having me on.
Hold it. All right, over here. Now we have Rick Barry, the great forward from the Golden State Warriors, guarded by Jamal Wilkes, another great all-star from the Golden State Warriors. Now, Rick, you've just been fouled. Now, what do you do?
All right, so we'd like to thank Curtis Harris of ProHoopsHistory.com for chatting with us about Rick Barry. Those are very interesting insights. One thing before we get into the bio and all that stuff about Rick Barry, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people, and me especially, when you mention Rick Barry, everybody thinks of the free throw, and it's the underhand free throw. It's a thing that was commonplace in basketball in its early history, and that's how everybody shot free throws. And then for a while they got away from it, but Rick Barry did not. Rick Barry was a man in his own island doing these underhand free throws forever. I mean, and he still stands by it. He's the guy that shouts at the anytime there's like a guy that doesn't have, isn't a good free throw shooter, your Shaquille O'Neal's, your Ben Wallace's, your Andre Drummond's more currently, they've always sort of interviewed Rick Barry and he's like, yeah, I could teach them how to do the underhand. And then they always go, no, I don't want to do it. It's just, he's synonymous with that free throw. And one thing we want to do before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the podcast is sort of talk about our favorite free throw routines. Because there's guys that are out there that have, the 3 bounce and I go do it or whatever, but there's so many unique ones out there. Do you have a particular one that you like?
He's not really necessarily my favorite player, but I've always really enjoyed the Rip Hamilton routine where he takes 2 routine dribbles and then like a really weird off to the right dribble and then comes back and takes the shot.
I won't lie. I've stolen this one. I steal this
nice.
One.
All right.
I do the Rip one for no reason I don't know why. It's just sort of, it's one that you kind of get. But the side dribble's nice. Yeah, I do the 2 and then the side.
There you
helps.
go. Well,
I don't know why.
I mean, I'm sure you have a Rick Barry-like percentage in your career, so.
Yeah. I probably should do the other guy. You know what? It's not a bad idea. I'm talking about all these other guys of Andre Drummonds who don't do it. I should probably start doing it.
Yeah.
I'm really good at it in horse. I don't know why I don't bring it out to the real games, but because that's another thing too. Everybody does it in horse. It's like the go-to, like it's not your first shot, it's not your second shot, but it's like 3 or 4 in the horse game. It's like someone's got HO and you're gonna do the granny shot is what they call it too, which I always find funny is that's what's synonymous with it is the granny shot.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure Rick Barry really loves to hear for a grizzled little guy. Other ones that I like, there's a few. Gilbert Arenas always had a fun one. the behind the back a few times. I always like Nick Van Exel's too. It was just like the most unique to me, because if you haven't seen it, if you're not familiar with the Nick Van Exel, he's like to the top of the circle. He's way deeper. Like most people just stand on the line and they get as close to the line as possible. He went back, which is just unique in its own right. Just unbelievably unique, actually.
That's another one. And then, some funny ones also are Jerry Stackhouse. He just bent really, really far down before, then bending back up and taking that shot, which is such a low bend. He's almost touching the floor, and then Jason Kidd, of course, classy Jason Kidd, the NBA's leader in class, where he kisses his hand and then he touches his backside and then he kisses his hand again and then shoots the free throw. I guess my understanding is that is him telling his wife to kiss his ass. That's my understanding of that, but I guess I can't confirm that with my deep NBA
I feel like he did that before the wife.
Well, maybe he did. Then maybe I'm maybe
he added
that's
the
what
ass
I'm thinking.
part.
Yeah,
because I know we always did the kiss, but maybe I never saw the
Yeah, I didn't notice it either until I watched a few more, and then they showed it from like a different angle, and you can see him touching his ass. So. Jason Kidd,
and that's the homage. There's a few of those too. You have the Jeff Hornacek who rubs his the side of his cheek. Someone else does something, but I know there's a bunch of other weird ones too, like guys talking to themselves or Karl Malone. You have Dirk humming.
Yeah. Jeff Hornacek is a lot sweeter, at least, because it's in honor of his kids. He's not insulting anyone. He's not insulting an ex. And then I like Don Nelson's one-handed free throw. That was always unique. And of course, Don Nelson has that famous free throw. I think it's in the '69 finals to beat the Lakers, where it just bounces on the rim forever and then finally falls in.
Right. I know Nelson was an interesting one. I believe the NBA 2K, I think it was 2K12 was the first one where they had all a lot of the older guys and really sort of went all in on having a lot of retro players or whatever. And I remember him being an interesting one to do. I remember the Rick Barry one was impossible to get a hold of at first because it's just so unique and so different. But I thought that was a nice touch that they went back, and a lot of these older guys that had the weird sort of free throws, they went in there and did that. Nelson, I remember, and obviously Rick Barry. Before we sort of move on to other stuff, the underhand free throw, which obviously, as mentioned, is synonymous with Rick Barry, is synonymous with nobody else in today's NBA. There is not a modern guy who's even thought about attempting it. I know recently Andre Drummond, they sort of talked to him about, hey, is this something you would like to do? He's a guy who's, hovering around 50%. He said, nope, not going to do it. No way. Shaquille O'Neal famously said, no, I'm not going to, Rick Barry would go out of his way to say, I will help you. I promise you, I will make you a dominant player. And Shaq said, no, I'd rather shoot 45% or whatever. The only guy that I found recently, and this was in an article about the art of the underhand free throw from SB Nation, which is a really good long form piece just on Rick Barry in general as well. It was George Johnson, who was actually a teammate of him on the 75 championship Warriors team. He was a center who shot 55% using the standard method. Barry said, hey, look, I'm going to help you. I'll show you how to do it better. And lo and behold, showed him how to do it better. And he became a really good free throw shooter. I mean, he stayed in the mid 70s, which I don't know if I'd count really good. Rick Barry sort of mentioned that 80 was what he considered a good and then 90 was elite. But mid 70s isn't bad for a guy who's shooting 55. It's a stark difference.
That's
between,
a big improvement.
That's a lot of points.
75 is a little bit better than league average. So, I think that's worth, if you're a big man shooting 75% free throws, I think that's pretty good. I'm going to say that I will say that Rick Barry is probably the worst spokesman for his own cause, just because of how blunt and how undiplomatic he is. And so I can understand players resisting a call from Rick Barry to
especially for him to teach you. I'm sure that's not
right. Well, I can't
either.
imagine it would be that difficult to what is there to teach exactly? Just start shooting it underhand and kind of find what sort of works for your team. You could watch the Red on Round Ball segment with Rick Barry and basically get the lessons that you need. It's relax your legs and then and hold the ball at the seams and then sort of flick the wrists. I think that was kind of the one thing that I took from that was the wrist shot. That was sort of an interesting. They showed it in slow motion and the way the ball rotates and the backspin that you get and that's actually pretty interesting. And it's sort of weird obviously because it's so different, but like you watch him do it a few times and then you don't even think about it, like, oh, it's weird. Like, you just think about, oh, that's how Rick Barry shoots free throws, and they go in most of the time.
That's why I'm always interested that other guys haven't, that nobody, not a single shooter has adopted it, because the first time you do it, everyone's going to go, whoa, and then, it might look sort of weird, and maybe, you don't bring it out until you've in practice done it a little bit, and maybe in the middle of the game you do it, but it's just like, it's all just an embarrassment level. But I feel like, and that's what people say is, oh, it's embarrassing, or I look like, I feel like after you hit 2 of them, no one's going to care anymore. You know what I mean? Where if it's a crunch situation, you hit one.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be a story anymore. I mean, you're going to get some beat reporters and some big stories of, whoa, he's bringing back the underhand free throw. But after a while, I feel like it's okay. But you get a guy like Barry who, as I mentioned, is synonymous with it. And the reason he's synonymous with it is because he won't stop telling you about it as well. As like every interview, people go to him. He's always got an opinion about, his free throw shooting and underhand free throw shooting. And we're, saying that he's the best free throw shooter of all time, which is not really true anymore. But,
Yeah. Oh, he's close. I mean, he's third. 89.3% for his career. We'll give him that. That's pretty good. There is one exception to that we didn't mention, is that the Birdman actually attempted 2 free throws underhanded. I think it was when he had an injured wrist. So he actually did at least a couple times. And I guess, if any NBA character is going to try to do the free throw underhanded, I think I would guess Birdman would think. One thing I can't believe like that it hasn't at least been tried in practice or in, like somebody has to have had at least like looked at it and at least think about it and try it in practice, and maybe it just isn't practical for everyone, because it would be a completely different way to do it, and that might be more difficult than just sort of adjusting what you're doing now. I mean, that might be more of a change than most players want to do. It may have less to do than we think about the idea of being embarrassed by it.
Right.
So, but who knows? Because no one does it. No one really talks about it. So
one day.
Yeah. Well, next we're going to look a little bit at the early life and career of Rick Barry. We'll be back in a moment. All right, we're back, and we're here to talk about the early life and career of Rick Barry. And he grew up in New Jersey. His grandfather was known as Big Dick Barry, who kind of all right, why are you laughing, Rich?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right.
He was kind of a carouser who squandered his family money, and
I just feel like his name isn't Big Dick because he was a tall guy, but
yeah.
I mean, he probably was, but I feel
he might have been a beefy guy too. I mean, well, he is Rick Barry's, grandfather, so he may have been tall. There's certainly that is certainly a possibility. But so Rick's parents were they kind of salt of the earth types who worked. His dad was a basketball coach and taught Rick the game, and Rick's older brothers, well, they were all good basketball players. Rick's older brother probably could have been a pro, but he suffered an injury before he got to that point. He was definitely, as I mentioned earlier, was a bit of a rapscallion growing up. He just was very resistant to listening to anybody. He was obsessively competitive, stubborn and willful. He had a horrible temper, which was not something that really went away as he got older. It may have mellowed slightly at different points in his career, but and in fact, he says, let's face it, I provoke trouble, I shoot my mouth off too much, and I'm quick to throw a punch. So, that's a pretty, strong indictment, I guess, already. So he just had a, he had basically like a middle class, maybe lower level upbringing, you could say. He ended up going to the University of Miami to college for Bruce Hale was the coach there, and at the time Miami wasn't necessarily the powerhouse that you would think it would be now. I mean, it's never really been a basketball powerhouse, but certainly wasn't any kind of sports powerhouse, but they had a solid program at the time, and he certainly was the best player that they had there, probably the best player they've ever had there. He was with his father-in-law, Bruce Hale, not his father-in-law at the time, but his future father-in-law, Bruce Hale. He later met and pursued and married his daughter, and it was a very good experience for him. He ended up being leading the NCAA in points and was quite a fantastic college player. Then he was drafted. He ended up being the third player overall, the second player for the Warriors. So Bill Bradley was drafted first by the Knicks, and then his Fred Hetzel was drafted by the Warriors. And Fred Hetzel ended up not really, having a solid pro career, but nothing, particularly special.
It's the drafts are actually, and this time this is, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this because a little bit later when we're going to talk about sort of the widespread changes of the NBA. And this draft was actually the last one that had territorial picks as well. So it's sort of muddy on exactly where Barry was picked. Like in the true sort of overall players, he was third, as you mentioned, but in like the first round, he was the second pick in the first round because there was 3 guys taken territorially and those weren't rounds or whatever. And it's a whole different animal when you have imagine, I mean, there's still times where people sort of will insinuate that NBA still kind of has these sort of things where, hey, LeBron, you're going to Cleveland, or, Derrick Rose, he the lottery, Chicago, hey, who'd have known? But this was just blatant. It was like, all right, Bill Bradley, you're from New York Knicks, you have Bill Bradley. Right. Like Gil Goodrich, you're from Los Angeles, go to Lakers. Yeah, exactly. Like it's just it's shocking to think of a league that would do. I mean, Wilt Chamberlain obviously famously, was it as well. It's so funny to imagine like a league where it would be that blatant. Yeah, where it would be, this guy is from your town, you get this guy. You know what I mean? And it's kind of cool in a way. It's like you couldn't do it today. It'd be complete anarchy if you did it today. But I think it's still a fun idea that to prop up, your region and to prop up your team, and you get those sort of local stars. So that it's always interesting. But this was unfortunately the last of the territorial rights. So where he was drafted is kind of interesting, but
if there had been a Miami team, that definitely they probably would have had that would have probably been a good guy to have in that franchise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's always, and you always think of that too, because there's some guys where you're like, oh, why didn't he go to a team? And then you forget that they didn't. There was there wasn't those teams or whatever.
Too bad the Heat were 25 years too late.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, soon enough.
So there was some questions going in about Barry and his durability, because he was tall but relatively skinny, whether he could hold up to the demands of the NBA. But he proved those doubts to be silly pretty quickly. He was Rookie of the Year. He had a fantastic rookie season. His team barely. They missed the playoffs. They came within a few games of missing the playoffs. So they weren't far off, but they did have a losing record. They had Al Attles was one of the stars on the team. And of course, the big star there was Nate Thurmond, who's actually only in his second year. The Warriors weren't only a couple seasons removed from trading Wilt Chamberlain to Philadelphia, and they hadn't really done particularly well with Philadelphia, so they thought, well, we might as well just trade him because things aren't going well. Guy Rogers, a guard, was another one of the important players in that rookie year for him. But they were 34-46. Their coach was Alex Hannum, who had just really is regarded as one of the better coaches in pro basketball history, but just it was a guy who coached everywhere, and did end up winning a couple of NBA championships and an ABA title. And in fact, in Barry's second year, he is the coach for the 76ers against Rick Barry's team in the in the 67 finals. A lot of 6s and 7s there.
One game that I from his rookie year that's super interesting is a 57-point performance in Madison Square Garden, but unfortunately it was a loss to New York. And one thing I found pretty funny, and you could tell it's classic Rick Barry. He was 21 of 22 from the free throw line. So
they finished 7th in a 9-team league. I like that 6 of the 9 teams made the playoffs in the league.
Because I read that when we were looking that up, I sort of laughed because you get so many people these days that are like, the NBA is stupid. Everybody makes the playoffs. Right. And it's like, it was better in the old days. And like in the old days, literally 75% of the teams made the playoffs. So that's
exactly
very funny. Where everybody gets to go to the playoffs now. Well, no, actually. A lot less than ever, but
so Barry was touted for his ability to get to the hoop. Like, he wasn't necessarily as good of a shooter as you might expect, which you would kind of think based on his free throw percentage. Of course, he wasn't shooting everything else underhanded, so he wasn't necessarily a great shooter, particularly, especially at first. I think that's something he worked on later, but he was just really able to get to the basket, to get around his opponent, to also moved really well without the ball, and of course was able to draw a lot of contact and get so many free throws and make so many free throws that was something that obviously made him a great player right away.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, you do sort of feel like he should be a better shooter just based off, as you mentioned, the free throw shooting. Yeah. You sort of attribute good shooters to good free throw shooters, but he wasn't quite that. And as you mentioned, he found a trick to shoot the free throws. There was no trick to shoot a jumper off the dribble. So that's,
if you look later at his 3-point percentage, it was never particularly strong. It was just like, he was a good enough outside shooter later that he could pay for defenses that sagged on him, but he definitely was. That was not his strength. So his second,
but he could score, so it didn't matter. Man knew how to score.
So his second season, he led the league in scoring. He was on the All NBA team again. However, there was a new coach, Bill Sharman, another one of the great coaches in history. He's going to lead the Lakers to greatness in the 70s, but for whatever reason, Rick Barry did not care for Bill Sharman, and Rick Barry was a guy who definitely had problems with his coaches. He didn't care for his high school coach. He had issues with some of his ABA coaches. He says nice things about Sharman as a person, but says he's miserable to play for. They were just too fanatical about basketball, too much practice that wore out the team, and Barry wasn't really that huge on practice either. Barry, kind of in his attitude, reminds me a lot of Allen Iverson. Mm-hmm. And just of sort of like, because he was so talented and because he was so skilled, one, he didn't feel like necessarily all the rules applied to him, and also that and he worked so hard during games that why should practice be something that he had to focus on as much? Yeah. So and especially hated the morning shoot-arounds that became Sharman's trademark, and eventually were something that became like big in the NBA. So so they played in the 76. They made it to the playoffs in 76. They made it to the finals, even though they were actually third in the league in their record. They had 44-37, which was number one in the West, but the 76ers were 68-13, which was the best record of all time at the time, and the Celtics were 60-21. So they definitely were quite a bit below those two teams, but those two teams had to face each other in the playoffs. Finally, Chamberlain got past Russell in a playoff series, and the Sixers and Warriors played a pretty hard-fought 6-game series, considering the difference in records between the teams. Barry played well during that series, averaged 40.8 points per game, during that series. So he played pretty well. One thing I'll say about Barry is that he was always willing to. He always thought that Thurman was the most valuable player on his team, and he was really always willing to talk up how great Thurman was, which you didn't necessarily have to do because all the attention was based on him. But he was a guy who at least he was certainly a guy who was critical about everyone and everything, but he was also willing to kind of be critical about himself a lot, and also was willing to at least not let his ego get in the way of things completely.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Yeah, if he had a few guys that he really, really trusted and really enjoyed and really liked, and was really hard and really on top of praising them and letting everybody else know how good they were, and sort of deflecting some of the attention from him to them. But few of those. I mean, otherwise, most other people, not really. But He had a few, so he had a small circle. One thing interesting about this year before we move on to the next year, and then when it gets real interesting for him, I thought you mentioned he led the league in scoring. I looked this up. He had 6 50-point games and 22 40-point games that year. So not bad.
And
not a bad day at the office.
He was also MVP of the All-Star game that year. And he one thing that he said in his book is that he was great. He was really glad they led the league in scoring, of course, but he did say that was basically something Wilt could have done at any time that he wanted to. But that was the year that Wilt wanted to lead the league in assists, so he kind of changed his game to do that. And he was mostly critical of Wilt. He even used the term loser to describe him and said that everybody knows that he falters in big moments and a lot of the things that you get when people talk about Wilt. But he at least was willing to say that. So yes, the next season he actually does not end up playing. He negotiates with the fledgling Oakland Oaks of the fledgling ABA, who are owned by Pat Boone. Yes, the singer Pat Boone. And
oh, ABA, I love you.
And he's one of the co-owners. And they end up signing his father-in-law as general manager of the team. That's sort of one thing to woo him, although they at least Bruce Hale tried to sort of keep it like you make your decision based on what you think is best, not this kind of thing. And then they ended up using a lot, of like 15% ownership of the team and things like that to try to get him to sign. Eventually he agrees to sign. He feels like the offer that the Golden State owner wanted to go for him, it wasn't quite as much. Eventually he does give him close to the same salary, but it's right at the end. He's like, I've made this commitment. Sorry. So he ends up going to the league. There's a lawsuit and then he there's a lawsuit that he ends up losing. And basically the reserve clause is enforced. That means that, he had a 2-year contract with the team, and then the reserve clause means that he either has to play for the team or play for nobody, and he chooses to play for no one. Although he came very close to actually playing with the Warriors that year for a while. He had some talks with the ownership, and they almost got him to play, and then he decided that he just didn't want to. And this was definitely something that gave him a reputation as selfish and money hungry. I mean, this is really the beginning of players taking a much stronger ownership of themselves. This, and of course the more famous lawsuit in baseball by Curt Flood, is going to lead to players eventually having the right to free agency and salaries escalating a whole lot, and is going to definitely change the relationship between fans and players now that players are just going to be making so much money, and athletes are going to be so specialized that it takes them, kind of away from the average fan.
Yeah, you always hear that thing of, you go to the train station and there was the athlete because he was just one of the guys or whatever. He was just really good at, X sport or whatever. And yeah, this was the beginning of them sort of becoming otherworldly celebrities. Exactly. And not with the people.
Yeah, so, yeah. And Barry thought, he realized like a lot of the things that a lot of the ABA's promises didn't come true. He thought that other NBA players would jump to the ABA with him. He says he was naive, felt he didn't do research, didn't have a lawyer with him during a lot of it. So, but on the other end, he was happy that he felt that he opened the door for other players to get more money. He does argue in the book, he did argue in his book that he had a lot of, that he absolutely felt that it was right for players to be able to jump to other teams, just like owners are able to, move teams to other cities. And he felt, he absolutely, it's a very passionate and quite eloquent, actually, argument in favor of that. So he didn't feel bad he felt that he had the right to make the decision, but what ended up happening to him in the ABA was definitely a disappointment. And if there were a lot of regrets about leaving the Warriors, particularly the fact that they were a young and up-and-coming team who could have definitely had a lot of success.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're not doing this justice. As I mentioned, Terry Pluto's great book, Loose Balls, does a really good, just great discussion about this particular topic, and Barry going over and just sort of what the ABA's main goal was. And one of the big things was, Barry felt slighted, but the ABA, that's exactly what they wanted, was a guy like Rick Barry of, hey, we took one of your top guys, a nice young star, whatever. This is really what the ABA wanted. And really the ABA's goal was to at some point get a merger with the NBA. So these like ragamuffin owners could actually buy NBA teams because they weren't allowed to before. So it's very interesting. I mean, the ABA is just the most fascinating thing in the world. Like I could read and talk about the ABA all day, but yeah, it's.
And, the NBA is about to allow a lot more owners into its club, and a lot of them, the owners that they have at the time are problematic, much less adding, they're going to be adding 15 in the next 15 or so years, just imagine that, of that level of expansion. So, it is looking at both leagues, but particularly in the ABA, of just like how much of a disorganized mess a lot of it was just is pretty amazing in modern retrospect. And you're right, Loose Balls absolutely captures that just so well. So he's able to play in the 68-69 season with the Oakland Oaks. They're a very successful team. They win the ABA championship. They finish 16-18. Alex Hannum actually is their coach. The year before, Bruce Hale didn't go very well. They didn't have much talent, and they decide to he's like, let's bring in Alex Hannum to take over as coach. Well, Alex Hannum also kind of negotiates to take over as GM as well, so Bruce Hale is sort of marginalized. That kind of leads to some tension, particularly with Barry and Hannum, especially after Rick Barry gets hurt about 35 games into the season. And he gets hurt actually in December, and then tries to come back for a little bit, but suffers a ligament injury in his knee, and so anyway, he just there's some feuding over Hannum feeling like he wasn't promoting the team enough, and that kind of led. A coach he really liked and got along with led to some division between them. He was able to dress for the ABA championship game and wear his uniform for that, the game in which they won the ABA championship. But he said he did it just because he wanted to protect his suede suit, because they would the tradition of throwing the guys into the showers. So I found that amusing. Rick Barry was quite a fashion plate, actually. There's a funny. It's a funny kind of blog, San Francisco blog post on the fashion of Rick Barry that shows a lot of his different fashions that he had over the different years of his career. And apparently he used to
all the way till today. Yeah, still.
He was really into dressing in fancy clothes, even to buy fancy clothes for his wife. So that's something that I definitely like. Or find amusing. So they win the championship, but there's definitely they're not happy, or Rick isn't happy when the team decides that they're not. The owners decide they're not doing well. Pat Boone's out, and they decide to sell to owners that want to take them to Washington to become the Washington Caps. And Barry didn't like the move. He decided he wanted to try to join the Warriors, but that unfortunately for him didn't end up happening. He eventually was forced to move the team. They did end up playing at least a little bit. They were an okay team. They finished 44-40. They lost the Western Division semifinals against the Denver Rockets, who are not related to either. Well, I guess they're related to the Denver Nuggets, aren't they? They're not related to the Houston Rockets, though.
I think so, yeah. The ABA lineage, too, and that's one of my favorite parts of Loose Balls, is there's a thing in the middle that sort of shows you all the teams to try to follow, what the hell, what team went where, what they got named, because, midway through the season, they moved all the way across the country, got a new name. One game they were this name, the next game they were that name. No, but I believe I'm almost positive they are the current Denver Nuggets.
Yeah. So he had another operation after playing a few games with the Caps. Ended up removing all of his cartilage in his left knee. And the fact that he lasted another 10 seasons with no cartilage in his left knee is pretty impressive. We'll give him that.
That's not bad. A lot of guys can, and we see modern operations now where they use similar stuff to that, and guys will get a few years, but it's just constant pain. But yeah, he that's. Without knowing that, you wouldn't know. I really don't think you would have known that or watching his game.
Yeah.
But I mean, his game did evolve a little bit at this point, but still, it's still remarkable.
Right? Yeah. He says during the time that he was just kind of really upset with the situation. He had to force himself to kind of go all out for the first time, where before that had been instinctual. And he also said that he became, or it sort of described as he was became a little more of a perimeter player. Rather than a slasher after knee injury, distributing more. And I think that there also was part because he had to change his game because he had to be more of a do-it-all player in the ABA because the ABA just wasn't quite as strong of a league. So I think we're going to take a break here and talk a little bit about the Rick Barry family. So we'll be right back to talk about that.
Thank you, Charlie. We've got a good one here. Seattle leading by 1. They had to come back to do it. They had trailed by as many as 11 points, but came back to lead by 1 right at the half. And by the way, before we analyze that, I don't know if we can get a shot or not, but I am surrounded by Barrys here. As you know, Rick played at Golden State. His youngsters, or a couple of his youngsters, are with him tonight. A couple of good-looking ones, too. That's Brent on the left of your screen and Drew on the right. Boys, it's nice to have you with it. And they're good analysts.
Yeah, they're really tough. Brent on the left, they only won 75-36 this afternoon. The Warriors should do as well.
Are you a good little league father? I mean, you lay off the kid.
I do.
I know you do. You would. A player always knows to do that.
All right, so we're continuing our discussion here about Rick Barry. Talk now about his children, who it's a prolific family. 4 sons with his first wife, Pam. It's Scooter, John, Brent, and Drew. So you probably know 2 of those. You might not know the others. He also has another son with his third wife, I believe, Canyon. Third wife, I guess. I lose track of Rick Barry's wife.
The first 2 are Pam, which is confusing. So
yes, damn you! Oh, they're both Pam. Oh, that's okay. That's why I didn't know.
The third one I forget.
That's weird. You can't do that. You can't.
The third one I forget her name, but the number 2 is Pam. So.
Oh, you can't have both me and Pam. And then he has another daughter who was adopted. I believe that was with Pam as well. Yeah. But go over his sons here real quick. You have Scooter, who played for the Jayhawks, Kansas's Jayhawks. They won an NCAA title. Then he went on to play 17 years professionally in the U.S. and overseas. Germany, Spain, Italy, France, Belgium, Australia, all over the place. He won a CBA title in 1995, a Belgian League title in 2004. So he played all the way up until 2004. And then he reached the NBL finals in 95, and that's the Australian League, I believe, the NBL. John Barry, who you're probably familiar with from various TV outlets right now, he was played over 14 NBA seasons. Not bad. He was averaged 12.2 points per 36 minutes. He had a career high 7.5 win shares in 2001 and 2002 with Detroit. Very interesting thing about John Barry is, though, he seemed to leave every team just as they were about to get their peak. Obviously, as I mentioned, that 2001-2002 Detroit team, he left then the year before they won their title, eventually the 2003-2004 season. And then he was also with Sacramento on 2000 to 2001 and then left. And then they actually had, obviously their peak there for the next 3 years or so, battling the Lakers. He was off that team. So that's kind of the career of John Barry. Brent Barry, who I believe I can go out on a limb and say is probably the most successful of the Barry boys. Would you agree?
I would say probably yes.
Yeah, definitely. He averaged 12.9 points per 36. Not a ton of difference from John, but still pretty good. 14 years as well in the NBA. 2001, 2002, he had his highest win shares, 12.1. So that was a Barry taking over season. You have both your Barrys having career high win shares there. So Brent, the reason I said he was probably the most successful is he won 2 championships as a member of the Spurs, which you probably remember. When he won, he was the second father and son duo to win NBA championships, following the, I cannot pronounce that, their last name at all. The Gugases, is that it? Okay, I've never known how to exactly pronounce it. I don't think anyone's ever talked about it, but they were the first father-son duo to win championships, and this was repeated by the Waltons, of course, because you of course remember Luke Walton's contributions to many numerous NBA championship teams. So, and as well, if you add in the CBA and the Belgian League and a bunch of other leagues, you'll have a father-son combo there. Drew Barry is the all-time assist leader at Georgia Tech. He played briefly for the Fort Wayne Fury in the CBA, and then briefly in the NBA with the Atlanta Hawks, the Supersonics, and the Golden State Warriors, and played in Poland as well. But only had about 134 points in the NBA, so not a big not a big mark as well. So yeah, Brent and Jon, who are obviously the two kind of patriarchs there. The third, or the fifth son rather, Canyon, currently plays for the College of Charleston Cougars. And interestingly enough, and hopefully, I don't know if he's going to make his the NBA. I'll be rooting for him. But this man shoots free throws underhand. He takes over from the lineage of his father. And I watched a few interviews there, and he just basically was like, "Hey, my dad wanted to teach me, so I was willing to learn." So he shoots free throws underhand, shoots it pretty well, and is a good free throw shooter. So I don't believe he has NBA aspirations, but still, if he does make it, there's our guy that we talked about. But famously, before we sort of get into the middle of his career, and we sort of talked about his children, there's sort of Rick Barry was not a very good father, and famously, I don't know if it's famous or not, he just one day, his NBA career was ending. He just didn't come home one day. That's the story that Brent and Jon sort of talk about. They've since reconciled with him a little bit, but essentially, as I believe Scooter put it, that he just knew that when his career was going to end, he would have to come home and take care of kids and do that sort of stuff. And Rick didn't want to do that, so he just basically left and never came back. And they've since, as I mentioned, they get along. They're on decent terms now, but obviously you still lose a lot of will there. And there is another quote that I read as well that they always ask, Brent and Jon, hey, why did you never do underhands free throw or, free throws underhand? And they said, well, we wouldn't want to do it because that would be, an homage to our father. And we want to not do that. So not a good father at all. A lot of stuff too, before he actually left, that he was just, it was all revolved around him. Everything was big about him. Rick was the centerpiece of everything. Just kind of and you sort of knew that from the other stuff with Rick, that he was a selfish sort of guy. He was very focused on what he was going to do, and apparently just not a very good father overall. But either way, he has kids that are famous, so he's got a little bit of a lineage there, and we'll see how Canyon Barry does. But yeah, pretty interesting there for the lineage there. Do you want to get into the middle of his career now? Anything else you want to add about his children?
Well, you did forget to mention Jon's contributions to the 2004-2005 Hawks, who were the 13 win Hawks, who were my they were the first NBA team that I followed closely when I got really back into the NBA. So, but he was traded in the middle of the year anyway for Tyronn Lue, who I liked a lot better. So
I remember that team a lot. That's is that the Antoine Walker year too?
Yes, that would be the Antoine Walker year. Yeah,
it's okay.
Well, we got a draft pick for him, so.
Right.
Actually, that
wasn't
ended up
too
being
bad.
Rondo, which we traded, so that actually didn't really end up working out well for the Hawks, but oh well.
But small
exactly.
victories. So, all right, so we'll take a quick break here, and then we'll get into the middle of Rick Barry's career.
All right, so now we're talking about the middle of Rick Barry's career. Things do not work out so well for the Washington Caps. They decide they want to move to Virginia and become the Virginia Squires and play in 4 different cities in Virginia. Barry, not so excited about this. If Washington, D.C. did not appeal to him, then rural towns in Virginia, not so much so, or relatively rural towns. I don't want to insult any Virginians here, although Rick Barry did not have any problem insulting Virginians because he talks. There's a SI article in which he says he did not want his kids growing up with a Southern accent, and basically just says terrible things about Virginia. In his book, he says that this is basically intentional to create pressure to get him to be traded, which is definitely a Rick Barry thing to do. So I guess it was effective. So it's just it's very funny that was the kind of thing that would lead to a trade. But I guess it makes sense. But I love how there's this quote. There's a quote from Rick basically they focus on his San Francisco lifestyle, and they talk about how he has a $18,000 Ferrari and a spectacular house on a hill overlooking a valley east of Oakland. Let's see. Basically, it's just painting him as just this huge rich elitist who has no interest in living in Virginia or among commoners or anything anymore. He does say there that he does want to stay in the ABA and wouldn't return to the NBA for $1 million a year, which so if he does get traded to the Nets for a draft pick and $20,000. He again misses time for a knee injury. He played only 59 games. the Nets finished 40-44. But they did make the playoffs. They lost in a playoff series, funnily enough, to the Squires, 4-2. He did get along with.
I would love to see the newspaper articles in Virginia.
Yeah.
At that time, we couldn't find any, but that would be. Sure, they had some choice words.
There's a few quotes. There's a few quotes at the end of his book that have some newspaper accounts, and I think there's a couple things from Virginia papers mentioned in there. He did like his coach, Lou Carnesecca, who was most famously as the St. John's coach. But he was this was his first foray into pro hoops. I said he was disciplined, but he was easy to talk to. And Rick liked the fact that the ABA talent had improved. He called the Nets a good organization. And it's also around this time in which there's an AP story comes out where his wife calls him "my husband, the hypochondriac," because there's one thing about Rick is that he. In addition to many reputations, he also had a reputation for going after the refs all the time, yelling and screaming and so forth. And he said he did that because when he stayed quiet for a while, they wouldn't give him the calls. So he did that just because it gave him the calls. And he says something that I think is sort of implies that he is willing to flop or willing to overact his injuries, but his wife more charitably labels him, I guess, as him thinking that he's always more hurt than he ends up being. So I found that funny given the modern debate over flopping and things like that this was something, of course, that was going on even then.
Yeah, or are they people? Oh, these new NBA players, all they do is complain to the refs, after every call or whatever, and then you watch, and one favorite. We're watching videos of Rick Barry, and you see the other teams. I mean, everybody's just doing it constantly. I know the famous one is we'll talk about in a little bit when when the Warriors win the championship. You see the other team just complaining, and you see it just watching this game. It's just like every play, it's just complaining to the refs and arguing at him, and you got announcers saying that refs are the worst or whatever. But so when people sort of say, "Oh, Jeff Van Gundy, stop complaining about the refs," or "LeBron, just go and play," that's been the NBA forever.
Absolutely.
So.
And it's part of it does get annoying to watch sometimes, but yes, it has been part of the NBA forever. So. Things go a bit better in his second season with the Nets. He's finally healthy. He plays 80 games. The Nets finish 44-40. So the record isn't necessarily all that much better, but they do end up beating a 68-win Kentucky Colonels 4-2 in the playoffs, and then they beat the Squires 4-3. The Squires, that's their first year with Julius Erving. So that's an exciting time for them. Deep playoff run. They end up losing to the Pacers in the ABA Finals, but they certainly go farther than a team that with their record would be expected to go.
That's the Larry Brown coach Pacers, right? Was he? Because I know he coached.
No. I think Slick Leonard coached the Pacers for most of their ABA tenure. Actually,
he was Spurs, right?
That
Brown?
was later, but I don't think Larry Brown coached until later in the 70s. Rick Barry and Larry Brown were roommates in Washington. He was one of the few players that Rick kind of ended up, being close friends with, at least for a while.
He was Carolina Cougars and then Denver Nuggets.
Yeah, okay. He did do some coaching.
Sorry.
You're right. He did do some coaching.
But he ended up just coaching. Like when he actually got in the league, he coached primarily ABA teams forever too, which is a funny thing as well.
He
went to
New
Jersey. He went to the Nets after Denver,
the Clippers in
Indiana,
92 season. Yeah, and the Pacers too. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't realize that was. I hadn't noticed that before. That basically, most of his early career is all Pacers or all ABA teams. So. So they have a good run there. However, with all the lawsuits of things that are in court, a U.S. District Court issues a preliminary injunction that prohibits Barry from playing from any other team other than the Warriors after his contract with the Nets ended. Basically, it would have meant that he would have had to sit out another season if he wanted to continue playing for the Nets. So at that point, he decided that he would just instead go back to the Warriors. which he had wanted to do at different points. Although he did finally seem happy in New York. He did go. Golden State was a place that he wanted to go to as well. So that ended up working out, as we are going to see. Ended up working pretty well for him. So
yeah.
So he adjusts his game, becomes a better shooter, better passer, and primary ball handler. A kind of one of the a lot of people. There's always who gets the credit for being the first point forward, but he certainly is among those who definitely played that position. Yep. One thing that's noticeable is that his free throw drawing weight does go way down kind of around this point of his career. Again, he's older at this point, late 20s, getting into his 30s. He's had the injuries and, adjusting his style of game. So that's understandable. But that does sort of reduce his effectiveness overall as a scorer, although he still is, quite a tremendous player.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the assist percentage, as I mentioned, that rised a ton. You went from to 24.7 was his assist percentage that first year back in the NBA, and the previous high was 18.5, and then he never went below 20% again. So he definitely became a more facilitator. And yeah, it's the point forward thing is very interesting. But yeah, he's one that definitely should get a lot of the credit for it. I mean, it's at that time. I mean, he is really unique in that sense of being that height, being that sort of everything, and being a distributor, becoming more of a distributor than a slasher. So interesting though. It's fun to watch this kind of evolution of his game.
Definitely, and he interesting for the rest of his career. He never plays less than 79 games, except for his final season, which he played 72. So injuries are not really a major issue for him for the rest of his career. So some of the key players that he ended up playing with on that first Warriors team, Nate Thurman's still there. He's in his 9th season. Jeff Mullins at shooting guard. Cazzie Russell, who had played for, I believe, the Lakers and the Knicks, who was, kind of an important reserve player. You mentioned George Johnson, who he taught to shoot underhanded free throws. So those were kind of the key guys that he was going with. So they had Thurman and Barry again together, even though Thurman at this point was still an effective player, but he was getting older, obviously, and he wouldn't last with. He ended up really wouldn't last with the team too much longer. They end up having a pretty strong season. They win 47 games. And they actually beat the Milwaukee Bucks, who had 60 wins that year, with Kareem in the playoffs. But they fall in the conference finals to the Lakers. I think that was Wilt's last year with the I think that was Wilt's last year with the Lakers. So
72, 73. I believe so. Yeah,
they were 60-22. They lost to the Knicks in the finals that year. That was kind of the end of their. I think West was gone right after that as well. So, so he loses to rivals Bill Sharman and Wilt Chamberlain. So in 73-74, they miss the playoffs. They do end up drafting Gus Williams to play point guard. There's sort of some talk about kind of how his role as ball handler clashed with Barry's. There's also kind of some split about that. There's a piece written about how that year, talking just kind of about the Barry and the return of the Barry and Thurman partnership, and how they're playing so well together. Even though this actually, I think that was written in. No, this was written for the 73-74. So they've been back together for a while, though. I'm not really sure why. It seems like a piece that would be more appropriate for being written the previous season. But anyway, he also set his career high this season, 64 points at home versus the Blazers. And then the next season, the Warriors end up being retooled. They hire a general manager. their owner, who was I always have trouble pronouncing his last name, but
oh, I know. Yeah, I am not entirely positive.
Yeah, it's like Franklin Muley. Yeah,
Muley is word that's where I go, but it might be something different.
He's basically like there's just a whole like all these Sports Illustrated articles, and even in this book, there's just like he always feels like Rick Barry is like the guy, like the one who got away, and spends like a whole lot of time and energy getting him back, and so forth. And he's kind of like a sort of a fixture of both like ridicule and like awe of just like how he's able to succeed, and he always like makes these savvy things, even though he seems a little bit dumb for whatever reason. But he ends up actually hiring a general manager who kind of reshapes the team a little bit, ends up trading Thurmond and some other players. Dick Vertlieb, in fact, was the new GM. And then they end up signing Jamal Wilkes, who ends up having a huge impact as a rookie. Also, Phil Smith, who becomes an important player. Clifford Ray comes over in that trade for Thurmond. So they're kind of retooling the team. It's a much younger team. Really, Barry and Clifford Ray are the only, Barry and Jeff Mullins, and to a little bit of an extent, Clifford Ray are the only, real veterans on the team. And they definitely, they play more of a fast-paced style. They go 10 deep. Barry kind of reshaping his reputation a little bit, where he practices a little bit harder. He's the captain. He tries to keep his temper a little bit in check. There's an essay article that talks about they're not troubled by racial disharmony, which might have been expected in a club whose blacks outnumber whites 10-2. I'm not really sure why that would be expected, but that is what was thought at the time. Perhaps
different. It was a different era. Yes.
Area. He said he hasn't had any problems. Those that existed back when I was in college don't exist as much for the younger players today. And they also mentioned personal problems that caused brief separations from his wife, Pam, and they had recently adopted Shannon, who became their fifth child as well. And he had a really strong season that year, averaged 30.6 per game, shot 46.4%, led the league in free throw percentage and steals per game, and they had an even better postseason. They finished they were 48-14, which was strong, but they end up beating the Supersonics and then having like a really classic series against the Bulls that went 7 games and had a lot of had a lot of close games. A lot of the games, all but 2 ended up being 5 points or closer, I think. So, and that of course, Thurmond was on the Bulls for that series. So that's sort of interesting that he ends up being against his old Warrior teammates, and they end up going through, and then they end up sweeping the Bullets that year in that series. And the Bullets were 60-22, heavily favored in that series, seemingly a better team, but Barry led them through, and Barry was clearly like the guy like carrying that team. I mean, he really, he played by far the most minutes, by far the most points. I mean, that was clearly the best season of, as a pro, and he only finished third in MVP voting, which, was kind of apparently that was voted on by the players at the time, and that would sort of be seemingly a bad decision.
Yes, yeah, and at that time, we'll talk about it a little bit, the league that Barry left initially had changed a lot, and a lot of it was racially as well. It was becoming a predominantly black league, and he sort of alludes to that too, but sort of stays out of it, that because the players sort of picked that they wouldn't pick a white guy to win it or whatever. They would more pick, there was just a lot of issue, and this would happen more and more throughout the next, the rest of Barry's career, is that it would be a very interesting league for a while, and especially so when the ABA merged with it, it got even worse to a point where a lot of people, it became, the league was popular still, but it was sort of waning a little bit because a lot of fans were having issues with that, of the fact that it was becoming predominantly black, and obviously they would have to sort of work through that, and the NBA has obviously done well since then, but this is a very weird time for the NBA.
It's obviously a weird time for society too, because black people are demanded to hey, let's be treated equally, and people who aren't used to that are like, that's weird. Why do you want that? So,
no.
And that obviously happened in the NBA to a degree as well. And the players are just having more power, and the owners are resenting it. And I'm sure it was interesting for somebody in Rick Barry's position, being one of the few white stars, and certainly benefiting from racism in a sense, because he had probably had more endorsements than he would have if he was black. That's almost certainly true, and had opportunities that he would have had. Yet some of the black players didn't look at he mentions feeling racial tensions at the time. He was actually pretty smart about not putting his foot in his mouth when it came to matters of race. He spoke relatively intelligently about that, and was talked about his black teammates. Well, he didn't seem to have the problems that he would have when talking about other things. But yeah, I mean, it definitely was just something that was a part of what was going on in the NBA and in the whole world in there, and obviously encapsulate another thing that is an important part of the era that he played.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, so I think we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we're in fact going to talk about a lot of the changes that happened in Rick Barry's career.
Hi, I'm Rick Barry with three-time MVP Larry Bird. Larry, you've been called the best player ever. How does it feel?
You should know, Rick. You were pretty good in your time. What I do know is this year's official NBA K-Log is the best ever.
Wow, great-looking team clothes and accessories.
All right, we're back here talking about the life and career of Rick Barry. One of the things that we wanted to talk about is the massive changes that happened throughout Barry's career, and we talked about that in our interview with Curtis, and we've just sort of talked about it in general, is when he started, and he sort of was one of the patriarchs of this weird, dark era of the NBA, but it was a fun era of the NBA because a ton of changes happened, a ton of new things happened. He comes in, he's still sort of in the little tail end of the Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, that sort of stuff. Then you have this big era that, as we mentioned, is a little murky, a little dark. And then you have, obviously, the Magic Bird was his final year, I believe, was when Bird and Magic, their rookie seasons. But then you have this weird sort of in-between era where there was just so many changes going on in the world and then in the NBA as well. You have, obviously, the free agency and free agency compensation. We talked about that a little bit, of him sort of basically, in a lot of ways, helping to abolish the reserve clause, or at least giving it, I don't know if he was the one that necessarily abolished it, but giving it a lot of... Yeah. A lot of insight, or people were starting to look at it and go, yeah, is that right that's there? I mean, Oscar Robertson was the one who eventually did it. Sure. And then obviously Curt Flood, obviously in baseball, was the one that really, in a lot of ways, broke all the walls down. But Rick Barry has a lot of being one of the first guys to really challenge it. So interesting in that way. A ton of other changes as well in the NBA. Obviously, the three-pointer stands without reason, and that's one of the biggest evolutions in the game of basketball in my mind. It just completely changes how the game is played, spacing, dribble. I mean, everything changes because of having this line where you can get an extra point if you shoot from back here. It's something we take for granted these days, but when you watch old games, it's not there. You have a college undergrads being drafted, and the different changes of, okay, now juniors are getting picked, now freshmen are getting, this sort of stuff that was, you just didn't do it. It was just unheard of. We mentioned, before, the territorial picks, where Barry his draft was the last of the territorial picks. That is completely gone now, and guys from New York are immediately going to the New York Knicks. There's a lot more of the draft is really what we think of it now today. Obviously, the NBA going from 9 teams in his rookie season in 67 to 23 teams in 81 with the influx of the ABA, with the influx of a bunch of other, just new teams, expansion teams, that sort of stuff. This was kind of interesting. I never really knew when this came about, but in 1971, the NBA logo was created, and it's obviously not changed at all. There's been little tweaks here and there, but it's still the same. Quote Jerry West. I mean, they like to say it's not Jerry West. It could be anybody, but it's Jerry West. There's changes in referees and free throws as well, which are pretty interesting.
Yeah, they went from 2 refs to 3 refs, I believe, in the late 70s. There was, I think it was Barry's last season, but Barry's last season was the first year of the NBA three-pointer. He, of course, had the three-pointer in the ABA for a few years when he played there. And I believe that 80 was the last season for where you could shoot for 2 for 3, three tries to make 2 free throws. That was I believe the last season for that. So that was a NBA rule. That didn't apply in every single free throw situation, but it applied in a lot of them. I forget exactly.
It's very weird. Yeah, it's hard to.
It's one of those confusing things, but. Yeah, it's funny with the college undergrads. Like, it's funny to watch like the 83 and 84 drafts. Like even as late as that, and maybe even later, those players, anyone who wasn't a 4-year graduate, was called a hardship case. It was funny. That was like basically your way of avoiding that was to claim hardship, and that can be done in many different ways. But it's funny that terminology lasted for so long, even though it was obviously not for hardship reasons at a certain point, But yeah, I think the one thing that I think is underlooked at is just amazingly how in 14 years the NBA could add 14 teams, and just the amount of just how tumultuous that would be. In
a downtime too, in a time that a lot of people would consider, you sort of assume that expansion teams would come when the league's doing well, and they weren't. I mean, by and large, they weren't doing great at this point. They were doing okay.
I don't know if they were necessarily doing any worse than they were before that. They got some TV money, they got a CBS deal. I mean, I do think. I mean, there were definitely times in which attendance was down, but I think the idea that like the 70s were some sort of dark age is a little bit like the early 80s weren't necessarily much worse than the late 70s. It was just because now there's Bird and Magic, and eventually things got really good in the mid to late 80s. We think of that as like part of the golden era, when really it didn't start right away, kind of thing. So I think there might be a little bit that might be a little bit overstated, but it certainly is, but certainly is true that there was just so much change and so much, so many tumultuous things going on. But yeah, that whole thing of just adding so many teams. Of course, they added 4 because of the 76 ABA merger, and they added several in the late 60s, early 70s, and the Mavericks they were the last team to be added in 81, at least until the end of the 80s. It was funny that they waited until like the league finally grew a whole lot, and they're like, oh, I guess we should add some more teams. So, and now we have 30. You never know.
And I think for a while we're going to be a long way away. I think from.
You think so?
In your mind, do you think?
I don't know. I think. I mean, I think they really would like to get a team in Seattle, and there isn't really like an obvious candidate to move. So, but they probably have to add 2. I think there are cities with arenas and with markets where it could work. Columbus, we'll take a team.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I know we're a little close to Cleveland, but we don't like Cleveland. We don't go there. So we'll go to teams in Columbus. I promise. I love you, Cleveland. I'm just kidding. Maybe. So I don't know. That's about it. That pretty much covers the. Like I said, that's a lot of.
Those are things we take for granted. I mean, free agency and the 3-pointer.
Right, exactly.
A bunch of new teams.
Yeah.
And pretty much every team that's around.
Yeah,
now.
And of course, more playoff rounds come with more teams. The modern playoff system didn't really come into effect until 84. With the number of rounds that number of teams that go in, but there were definitely big changes between that time as well. So, no wonder that that era is just sort of tricky, just because of, how much things really changed,
Yeah.
So, I guess we'll take a little break, and then we will talk about the late career of Rick Barry. Okay, we're back talking about the late career of Rick Barry, and we are in the 75-76 season. Rick Barry has just won his first and only NBA championship, but the Warriors are still an exciting team. They actually have a better regular season record of 59-23. They are first of the then 18 teams in the NBA. This is actually the last season before the merger of the ABA and the NBA, and I believe this is actually the first season for the New Orleans Jazz. So, but they or maybe it was their second season. Regardless, the Jazz are the newest team in the league, and there's another good SI article talking about just how the Warriors play. They have They play a bigger rotation than most teams play. Talks about their coach Al Attles, who was, of course, he played with Rick Barry during the 60s and was a famous, tough guy that nobody messed with type player. And he says that
who got in a fight in the previous year in the NBA Finals, like the last game.
Yes.
Did you watch that video of when the Warriors win the championship?
Yeah.
In that game, I forgot who it was. It gave a real hard foul to Rick Barry, so he just ran out to the court and started shoving the guy and like throwing punches, and got thrown out of the championship game. But that's okay because and then he said that was a rallying cry for the team, or that helped.
Exactly.
Of course, if they lost, it would have been a distraction.
Sure, right.
Because they won, it's a rallying cry. So
it's been all over. Skip Bayless would have been on top of that guy today. So, but he talks about like there's everyone has a stereotypes and people soon everyone just accepts them instead of wondering why things work, and so he decides to try to do things that he has. He sometimes uses 4 guards randomly at once, sometimes 2 centers on the court. He just does. He just tries to do things differently a little bit. And it took him a while to kind of realize that Nate Thurmond didn't fit in, so they made things work. They kind of talk about the racial component of the team, but also one thing's that Rick Barry and Jeff Mullins are the only 2 players who are older than 27. Everyone are the kids. Talks about sort of the quiet, understated nature of Jamal Wilkes. He's like a character in a novel whose true importance is not revealed until it is time for the message to be delivered or the princess rescued. Sports writers back then, they just had a way,
It's reading this stuff in the 60s and 70s, man, it's a different era.
And talking about how what a great defensive player he was, shutting down Spencer Haywood and Bob Love and Elvin Hayes, and in the championship year, but there is an interesting tone at the end where Golden State wins now because everyone is fresh, ambitious, willing. Everyone except Barry is unknown, but they are known together, and Barry's side all make the same kind of money. Will it work when Wilkes and Smith and Williams arrive at greatness? Will there just be as much to go around then? And then it sort of leads because this Warriors team ends up disappointing a bit in the postseason. They beat the Pistons, who were in the West at that point, and they end up they beat the Pistons, but they end up losing to the Phoenix Suns that year, who end up playing in a classic final series against the Celtics. They're led by Paul Westphal and Alvin Adams, and it goes 7 games. It's another series with 5 games that are decided by 7 points or fewer. In fact, the Warriors are up. They're up 3-2, and then they lose by 1 to Phoenix in Game 6, and they end up falling at home in Game 7. So, a tough. Despite their regular season dominance, they fall in the playoffs, which just happens kind of randomly a lot in the 70s for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And then the next year, 76-77, they win 49 games, but they end up falling to the Lakers in 7 games in the conference semifinals again. So they have a lot of they have a lot of 7-game series that they play.
Yeah. And this era it's a very weird, and that's one of the things that's always interesting about this time too, is when you sort of go back in NBA history and you talk about the champions and the dominant teams and all that sort of stuff. This era is just weird because you have just like these teams that you assume should be dominant teams, and they just like get upset randomly in the play. I mean, like you very rarely get that anymore, where a team that sort of is the top team in the league or is one of the top few teams just gets upset by like random, and it seems to happen a lot here. And you get this era is just filled with just weird random champions. I mean, this is, I believe, when the Hawks get their title. You got obviously the Rick Barry thing. There's a lot of like kind of one title win things on the Sonics.
The Sonics
this era, later in this era, the Portland Trailblazers.
Yeah,
it's just a weird era of just like you just. I don't know. It's hard to explain either, and I think that's one of another reasons why a lot of people sort of don't remember this one, because there's not a team that defines it.
Yeah.
There's just numerous teams, numerous players, that do it. So it's very interesting though when you go through and watch these just weird upsets or what I would assume is upsets, in the playoffs.
Sadly, Rich, unfortunately, the Hawks actually won their title in '58. So.
Oh, was that? Oh, they weren't. Okay.
Yeah,
I think I was. Who was I thinking of? I'm sorry. Sorry to get your hopes up there.
It's a little sad, but the Warriors won in 75, Celtics in 76, the Blazers in 77, the Bullets in 78, and the Sonics in 79. So
maybe I'm thinking of the Sonics.
Yeah,
so, sorry.
That's okay. I mean, at least we still have a team.
At least you have a team. Yeah, I said, come on. Quit your bitching. You got a team.
So
the Bucks. That's another weird one too. You get the few Bucks years, but that's Kareem.
Yeah,
so that
right,
makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, so they were 71, I think. So, and they made it a couple more times too. But
yeah, they made it a few years later. Yes.
So the 76, 77 Warriors are kind of reconstituted. They have a rookie, Robert Parrish, who ends up playing for the Warriors for a few years. It's kind of a forgotten point in his career as well. So they're changed a little bit. They end up, and then after they fall to the Lakers in that series, they get reshuffled a little bit again. Let's see. Gus Williams ends up getting traded to the Sonics, and then he'd lead the Sonics to the 78 finals and the 79 title. So that probably wasn't the best decision that they ever made. And there may have been some tension with Barry on kind of ball handling duties or so on. Although that point, I definitely would have picked Williams over Rick Barry, but I guess Rick Barry was certainly better known. So. And then the 77-78 season, which is Barry's last at Golden State, they're 43-39. They still have Clifford Ray and Phil Smith. They end up getting Ricky Green, who is later he's a bit of a bit player on this team, but he ends up being like a really important guard for the Jazz in the 80s. And in fact, he and John Stockton were, co-point guards. I mean, he was ahead of John Stockton really for the first 3 or 4 years of Stockton's career before, he got older and they saw what they had in Stockton. But so basically the big highlight probably for Barry was he had his last 50-point game in 78. He scored 55 points at home against the Knicks. Again, doing well against the Knicks on March 28th, 78. So they didn't even end up actually making the postseason in his final year. So a little bit of a disappointment. Not really sure exactly what happened there because they, I guess they lost at that point. They'd lost Jamal Wilkes too. So
and he was a big part.
Yeah, he was an important player for them too. And I think he left as a free agent, if I'm not mistaken. He ended up at the Lakers, of course, and ended up being a pretty important part of the of the early Lakers championship teams. So yeah, they had some really good players. It just kind of seemed to fall apart for them.
Yeah, never really.
And then at that point, Rick Barry signed as a free agent with the 78-79 Rockets, and they finished 47-33. They lost in the first round to the Atlanta Hawks. It was only a 2-game series, the first round, it was a 3-game series, but they lost. You probably couldn't do a 2-game series. It was a 3-game series, and they lost 2 games. They were swept, I guess. I'm not sure what you call a 2-game sweep, but
that's a sweep. I think it's still a sweep,
it's sweep, I guess. I don't know. It's not like a gentleman's sweep because that would be impossible. Let's see. They were 47-35, but they look like a team that on paper should have been better. Like they had Mike Dunleavy, they had Moses Malone, who was in his 4th year. They had Calvin Murphy, Rudy Tomjanovich,
it's a good
Robert
team.
Reed, who was young. But yeah, they had they finished 47-35, and then the next year they finished 41-41. That's Del Harris's first year as coach. They do get past the Spurs in the first round in 80. But they are swept by the Celtics the next season. So it's funny that the Houston Rockets are in the Eastern Conference.
The Bucks are in the Western.
Right,
it's just like
the season after Barry retires, we end up basically having the alignment that we come to expect today in conference. They basically switched everything around so it made geographic sense for the most part. So, that's pretty much the. That's pretty much it for Barry's career the last 2 seasons. He's clearly aging. He slows down. All of his numbers start to falter. His free throw percentage is still great. I believe he led the league in free throw percentage 7 times. Yeah, so that's pretty good. And one year he did not lead the league, and it was 9-16. So that's going to be
who beat him that year?
I forget. They mentioned a name. I forget offhand.
That's got to suck for Rick Barry.
Yeah.
I bet he was pissed.
Yeah, I bet he was pissed too. That's something that probably he would get under his skin to not.
Let's see. Which the 9-16 year, the 76-77.
Yeah, like his scoring average dropped from 23.1 to 13.5, and he was starting to play like 32 minutes a game. Last season he played 25 minutes a game, so he was clearly a role player. The Warriors ended up getting. This was still the point in which free agency you got a compensation player for if your team signed a free agent. So the Warriors ended up getting John Lucas as their compensation player.
Oh, okay. So, it was Ernie DiGreggio.
Yeah.
Ernie DiGreggio.
Yeah,
the Buffalo.
that was who it was. So
the Buffalo Braves at that point, or what were they at that point? Yeah,
they were the Braves. I think it's still.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
94.5. So
yeah,
earned it. It wasn't just the one.
Good for him. Oh, yeah. And he didn't even have to do Underhand. He didn't have to be
exactly. So there you go.
Girl, so good for him. So I guess we'll take a little break, and then we will finish up with a little bit of talk about the rest of Rick Barry's life and career, and anything else to sum up his legacy.
All right, cool. Whenever you're ready,
right.
We can kind of.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about a little bit more about some things that about Rick Barry that might be interesting, or just talking about kind of the legacy of his overall career. He was a 4-time All-ABA first team, a 4-time All-Star in the ABA, a 5-time All-NBA first team. 8-time NBA All-Star, Finals MVP, and an NBA champion in '75. And Rich, what about some of his advanced statistics?
Yeah, the advanced stats, and some of these, I mean, like a few I really subscribe to, a few not so much. But I just thought it was interesting to sort of look at where he sort of ranks all time in a lot of these. Player efficiency rating per, he's 45th all time, which is not bad. That's pretty good. Win shares per 48, he's actually 63rd all time. I'm surprised by some of these, and these are, to mind you, these are combined ABA and NBA, so these are taking them both in together. So we're obviously not we're counting his ABA stuff a little bit as well. I thought this was pretty interesting. 7th all time in true shooting for the ABA, but he's not in the top 250 in the NBA ABA all time, which was interesting because a lot of the ones he sort of still hovers in there, but this one he's not there at all in the NBA ABA combined ones.
And that probably has a lot to do with the reduction in free throws that he had as his career moved on. I think that was certainly would be a big part of that. Also, he lacks the benefit. I mean, he did have the free throw in his last season in the NBA, but he doesn't really get the benefit for that at all, for his NBA career.
Yeah, exactly. And then 29th all-time in offensive win shares. One of the best ones, though, obviously, and we've sort of remarked about his playoff, his maybe his misfortunes in the playoffs and losing a few times here and there. But he was 6th all-time in playoff points per game. The only guys better than him are Michael Jordan, Allen Iverson, Jerry West, Kevin Durant, and LeBron James. So it's good company to be in that. But yeah, overall, I mean, I had assumed his advanced stats would be a little bit better than they are, but they're still not bad. I mean, he's still in that upper echelon of the NBA overall. And there was never really one thing that he did, you know what I mean, where there's not one thing that would really stick out or make the advanced stats really pop too much. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. His percentage, his overall shooting percentage, career wise was just, 449, which isn't bad, but is not like absolutely, fantastic. And he was still, basically as the NBA has, gone along, shooting percentages have just, gone up. And early in his career, particularly, was a time in which, there were still a lot of chuckers going on. There were a lot of low shooting percentages. So, you got to put that a little bit in context of the era in which he played too, obviously.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, and some of course, some of the controversial things that Rick got involved in. There was obviously the infamous incident that Curtis alluded to, where he was broadcasting with Bill Russell, and they're showing a picture of Bill Russell, I believe, from the 1960 Olympic team, and then Rick Barry refers to it as a watermelon grin. And the YouTube on this is long gone, long been disappeared. So it's hard to see. It's described very well in Bill Simmons's book. And my guess, I can't really. I've done a lot of research on Rick, and I can't really find like a whole lot of, or really anyone at all claiming that he was particularly racist, or from that respect, the people didn't really have complaints about him. I kind of consider this a little bit of like he probably felt like he knew Russell enough to kind of make that joke, and then he realized he didn't, and that it wasn't acceptable and that kind of thing. So
that's sort of how I think of it too. Like, you have guys, and not saying that it's right at all, but when he grew up, that was probably just a term that was used for, you know what I mean? I'm not saying that that's correct at all, but I could totally see, Big Dick Barry, mentioning that a bunch of times, and Barry just sort of offhandedly sort of letting his guard down and just being like, yeah, kind of joking around in a lot of ways. But obviously, if you watch the video and know about it, Russell didn't take it that way, and I think literally turned his back like in the middle of the broadcast to Barry, which was an uncomfortable situation for everybody. But yeah, I don't see it as, because there's nothing else that came up at any point, and he obviously was in a super racially charged era and never said anything else. So for him to at this point say something, I don't see it as, I see it as a lapse in judgment more than like an inherent any sort of racism.
He also makes a comment. He's doing some broadcasting from Michael Jordan in the 88 Doug contest, and I call that one the Chinese Superman because he comes in kind of sideways and slanted. Which, first of all, I don't even know what that means. And but yeah, I think a Rick Barry is like a guy from an older generation who thinks it's appropriate to tell racist jokes, and obviously,
like my grandpa, like
a
our
lot of people's
grandpas.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's just like you can't say that anymore.
It's like, well, you shouldn't have said it then either. But it's just like, grandpa, it's just like, that's, and it's wrong. Obviously, it's unfortunate, but I'm
not making an excuse for it.
I'm way less
you get
offended by it than I am by like actual like institutional like racism, like powers that be, like holding people down, that kind of thing. So I think these things have to be appreciated on the scale in which they happen. Sure. So. Yeah, but definitely there are a lot of people. There were some pieces that we mentioned the Rick Barry as a bad father piece. There's also a 1983 Tony Kornheiser SI article that weirdly I cannot find on the SI Vault. It's like one of the few. Like, it was linked to a few years ago, but I think when Sports Illustrated did a recent redesign, and I think that they're for whatever reason, those links don't work anymore, and for whatever reason, it can't be found. But there are some quotes from it that people say. It's just like guys like Robert Parrish, like you said, he had a bad attitude. He was always looking down at you. Mike Dunleavy says he lacks diplomacy. If they sent him to the UN, he'd end up starting World War III. And then a Warriors executive, Ken Macker, saying, "You'll never find a bunch of players sitting around talking about the good old days with Rick. His teammates and opponents generally and thoroughly detested him." But then there's a friend of his who was a former teammate.
What do you really think, guys?
Billy Poulter said, if you got to know Rick, you'd have realized what a good guy he was. But around the league, they thought of him as the most arrogant guy ever. Half the players disliked Rick. The other half hated him. So
I love that.
Yeah. So, it's just one of those things that, like, I don't think that probably Rick Barry is as bad of a guy as his reputation is. Like, I bet, like, if you did get to know him, you probably would like him, but he's just has that exterior for whatever reason that is just so terrible. And like,
and the ABA thing is pretty interesting too, because that's one that always people are, he's money hungry and all that sort of stuff. And he had to go out of his way and say, look, guys, I made less money going to the ABA. I mean, their contracts were identical.
Yeah.
He said he just wanted to, he wanted to do different stuff. He wanted to break the reserve, but he was always sort of painted in a weird. I feel like because he didn't talk. I don't think he addressed situations properly. So I think that people sort of narratives got built about him, and he didn't really do a good job of sort of dispelling them, or you know what I mean. Where if he was a better articulator and could actually say what he really meant or what he felt or what he was doing, it would be a lot better. Whereas he's I liken him a lot to
if he didn't always say what he meant and he felt.
That's true. Yeah, he didn't really have a filter either.
Yeah,
which
his book actually does a decent job, I think, of kind of giving his side and makes him maybe a little more sympathetic than you might otherwise be. Whether it's a trick or whether it's a good a better way of him expressing himself, or through his co-writer who actually also co-wrote Bill Libby, who also co-wrote a Jerry West book around the same Mr. Clutch, Jerry West book around the same time. I think that there's some things there that I think are interesting, and he's pretty he definitely says some things that make him look pretty unsympathetic too. But it is like I kind of said before, I do think that someone who is able to kind of criticize themselves and have some self-reflection, even though in a lot of ways Rick showed that he didn't really see himself very well, particularly when it came to being a dad. But I still think he did enough of it where I can kind of take some of the okay, you say some kind of bad things about other people. You're critical. You're very critical of other people as well. So if you're critical about yourself, I can accept that more than I can if you just if you're not able to take criticism or be critical of yourself.
Certainly, yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, Rich, I guess we've talked about all about we can about Rick Barry. It's great to talk basketball with you, and I look forward to doing it again.